Reason in Prison, the Middle Ages. About 10 years after the Edict of Toleration, Constantine the Great adopted Christianity. This momentous decision inaugurated a millennium in which reason was enchained, thought was enslaved, and knowledge made no progress. During the 2 centuries in which they had been a forbidden sect, the Christians had claimed toleration on the ground that religious belief is voluntary and not a thing which can be enforced. When their faith became the predominant creed and had the power of the state behind it, they abandoned this view. They embarked on the hopeful enterprise of bringing about a complete uniformity in men's opinions on the mysteries of the universe, and began a more or less definite policy of coercing thought. This policy was adopted by emperors and governments, partly on political grounds. Religious divisions, bitter as they were, seemed dangerous to the unity of the state, but the fundamental principle lay in the doctrine that salvation is to be found exclusively in the Christian Church. The profound conviction that those who did not believe in its doctrines would be damned eternally, and that God punishes theological error as if it were the most heinous of crimes, led naturally to persecution. It was a duty to impose on men the only true doctrine, seeing that their own eternal interests were at stake, and to hinder errors from spreading. Heretics were more than ordinary criminals, and the pains that man could inflict on them were as nothing to the tortures awaiting them in hell. To rid the earth of men who, however virtuous, were through religious errors enemies of the Almighty, was a plain duty. Their virtues were no excuse. We must remember that according to the human doctrine of the Christians, pagan, that is, merely human, virtues were vices, and infants who died unbaptized passed the rest of time in creeping on the floor of hell. The intolerance arising from such views could not but differ in kind and intensity from anything that the world had yet witnessed. Besides the logic of its doctrines, the character of its sacred book must also be held partly accountable for the intolerant principles of the Christian Church. It was unfortunate that the early Christians had included in their scripture the Jewish writings which reflect the ideas of a low stage of civilization and are full of savagery. It would be difficult to say how much harm has been done in corrupting the morals of men by the precepts and examples of inhumanity, violence, and bigotry which the reverent reader of the Old Testament, implicitly believing in its inspiration, is bound to approve. It furnished an armory for the theory of persecution. The truth is that sacred books are an obstacle to moral and intellectual progress because they consecrate the ideas of a given epoch and its customs as divinely appointed. Christianity, by adopting books of a long past age, placed in the path of human development a particularly nasty stumbling block. It may occur to one to wonder how history might have been altered. Altered it surely would have been if the Christians had cut Jehovah out of their program and, content with the New Testament, had rejected the inspiration of the Old. Under Constantine the Great and his successors, edict after edict fulminated against the worship of the old pagan gods and against heretical Christian sects. Julian the Apostate, who in his brief reign from AD 361 to 363 sought to revive the old order of things, proclaimed universal toleration, but he placed Christians at a disadvantage by forbidding them to teach in schools. This was only a momentary check. Paganism was finally shattered by the severe laws of Theodosius I, end of the 4th century. It lingered on here and there for more than another century, especially at Roman Athens, but had little importance. The Christians were more concerned in striving among themselves than in crushing the prostrate spirit of antiquity. The execution of the heretic Priscillian in Spain, 4th century, inaugurated the punishment of heresy by death. It is interesting to see a non-Christian of this age teaching the Christian sects that they should suffer one another. Themistius, in an address to the Emperor Valens, urged him to repeal his edicts against the Christians, with whom he did not agree, and expounded a theory of toleration. The religious beliefs of individuals are a field in which the authority of a government cannot be effective. Compliance can only lead to hypocritical professions. Every faith should be allowed. The civil government should govern orthodox and heterodox to the common good. God himself plainly shows that he wishes various forms of worship. There are many roads by which one can reach him. No father of the Church has been more esteemed or enjoyed higher authority than St. Augustine, died A.D. 410. He formulated the principle of persecution for the guidance of future generations, basing it on the firm foundation of Scripture, on words used by Jesus Christ in one of his parables. Compel them to come in. Till the end of the 12th century, the Church worked hard to suppress heterodoxies. There was much persecution, but it was not systematic. There is reason to think that in the pursuit of heresy, the Church was mainly guided by considerations of its temporal interest, and was roused to severe action only when the spread of false doctrine threatened to reduce its revenues or seemed a menace to society. At the end of the 12th century, Innocent III became Pope, and under him, the Church of Western Europe reached the height of its power. He and his immediate successors are responsible for imagining and beginning an organized movement to sweep heretics out of Christendom. Languedoc in southwestern France was largely populated by heretics, whose opinions were considered particularly offensive, known as the Albigeois. They were the subjects of the Count of Toulouse, and were an industrious and respectable people. But the Church got far too little money out of this anti-clerical population, and Innocent called upon the Count to extirpate heresy from his dominion. As he would not obey, the Pope announced a crusade against the Albigeois, and offered to all who would bear a hand the usual rewards granted to crusaders, including absolution from all their sins. A series of sanguinary wars followed, in which the Englishman, Simon de Montfort, took part. There were wholesale burnings and hangings of men, women, and children. The resistance of the people was broken down, though the heresy was not eradicated, and the struggle ended in 1229 with the complete humiliation of the Count of Toulouse. The important point of this episode is this. The Church introduced into the public law of Europe the new principle that a sovereign held his crown on the condition that he should extirpate heresy. If he hesitated to persecute at the command of the Pope, he must be coerced. His lands were forfeited, and his dominions were thrown open to be seized by anyone of whom the Church could induce to attack him. The popes thus established a theocratic system, in which all other interests were to be subordinated to the grand duty of maintaining the purity of the faith. But in order to root out heresy, it was necessary to discover it in its most secret retreats. The Albigeois had been crushed, but the poison of their doctrine was not yet destroyed. The organized system of searching out heretics, known as the Inquisition, was founded by Pope Gregory IX, about A.D. 1233, and fully established by a bull of Innocent IV, A.D. 1252, which regulated the machinery of persecution as an integral part of the social edifice in every city and state. This powerful engine for the suppression of the freedom of men's religious opinions is unique in history. The bishops were not equal to the new talk undertaken by the Church, and in every ecclesiastical province, suitable monks were selected, and to them was delegated the authority of the Pope for discovering heretics. These inquisitors had unlimited authority. They were subject to no supervision and responsible to no man. It would not have been easy to establish this system but for the fact that contemporary secular rulers had inaugurated independently a merciless legislation against heresy. The Emperor Frederick II, who was himself undoubtedly a free thinker, made laws for his extensive dominions in Italy and Germany between 1220 and 1235, enacting that all heretics should be outlawed, that those who did not recant should be burned, those who recanted should be imprisoned, but if they relapsed, should be executed, that their property should be confiscated, their houses destroyed, and their children, to the second generation, ineligible to positions of emolument unless they had betrayed their father or some other heretic. Frederick's legislation consecrated the stake as the proper punishment for heresy. This cruel form of death for that crime seems to have been first inflicted on heretics by a French king in 1017. In England, in the reign of Henry VIII, there is a case of prisoners being boiled to death. Heresy was the foulest of all crimes, and to prevail against it was to prevail against the legions of hell. The cruel enactments against heretics were strongly supported by the public opinion of the masses. When the Inquisition was fully developed, it covered Western Christendom with a net from the meshes of which it was difficult for a heretic to escape. The inquisitors in the various kingdoms cooperated and communicated information. There was a chain of tribunals throughout continental Europe. England stood outside the system, but from the age of Henry IV and Henry V, the government repressed heresy by the stake under a special statute, A.D. 1400, repealed in 1533, revived under Mary, finally repealed in 1676. In its task of imposing unity of belief, the Inquisition was most successful in Spain. Here, towards the end of the 15th century, a system was instituted, which nobody expected, and had peculiarities of its own, and was very jealous of Roman interference. One of the achievements of the Spanish Inquisition, which was not abolished till the 19th century, was to expel the Moriscos, or converted Moors, who retained many of their old Mohammedan opinions and customs. It is also said to have eradicated Judaism and to have preserved the country from the zeal of Protestant missionaries. But it cannot be proved that it deserves the credit of having protected Spain against Protestantism, for it is quite possible that if the seeds of Protestant opinion had been sown, they would in any case have fallen dead on the uncongenial soil. Freedom of thought, however, was entirely suppressed. One of the most efficacious means for hunting down heresy was the Edict of Faith, which enlisted the people in the service of the Inquisition and required every man to be an informer. From time to time a certain district was visited, and an edict issued commanding those who knew anything of any heresy to come forward and reveal it, under fearful penalties, temporal and spiritual. In consequence, no one was free from suspicion of his neighbors or even of his own family. No more ingenious device has been invented to subjugate a whole population, to paralyze its intellect, and to reduce it to blind obedience. It elevated delation to the rank of high religious duty. The process employed in the trials of those accused of heresy in Spain rejected every reasonable means for the ascertainment of truth. The prisoner was assumed to be guilty. The burden of proving his innocence rested on him. His judge was virtually his prosecutor. All witnesses against him, however infamous, were admitted. The rules for allowing witnesses for the prosecution were lax. Those for rejecting witnesses for the defense were rigid. Jews, Moriscos, and servants could give evidence against the prisoner, but not for him, and the same rule applied to kinsmen to the 4th degree. The principle on which the Inquisition proceeded was that better 100 innocent should suffer than one guilty person should escape. Indulgences were granted to anyone who contributed wood to the pile, but the tribunal of the Inquisition did not itself condemn to the stake, for the Church must not be guilty of the shedding of blood. The ecclesiastical judge pronounced the prisoner to be a heretic of whose conversion there was no hope, and handed him over, relaxed him was the official term, to the secular authority, asking and charging the magistrate to treat him benignantly and mercifully. But this formal plea for mercy could not be entertained by the civil power. It had no choice but to inflict death. If it did otherwise, it was a promoter of heresy. All princes and officials, according to the canon law, must punish duly and promptly heretics handed over to them by the Inquisition under pain of excommunication. It is to be noted that the number of deaths at the stake has been much overestimated by popular imagination. but the sum of suffering caused by the methods of the system and the punishments that fell short of death can hardly be exaggerated. The legal processes employed by the Church in these persecutions exercised a corrupting influence on the criminal jurisprudence of the continent. Leah, the historian of the Inquisition, observes, of all the curses which the Inquisition brought in its train, this perhaps was the greatest, that until the closing years of the 18th century, throughout the greater part of Europe, the inquisitorial process, as developed for the destruction of heresy, became the customary method of dealing with all who were under any accusation. The inquisitors who, as Gibbons says, defended nonsense by cruelties, are often regarded as monsters. It may be said for them, and for the kings who did their will, that they were not a bit worse than the priests and monarchs of primitive ages who sacrificed human beings to their deities. The Greek king Agamemnon, who immolated his daughter Iphigenia to obtain favorable winds from the gods, was perhaps a most affectionate father, and the seer who advised him to do so may have been a man of high integrity. They acted according to their beliefs. And so in the Middle Ages and afterwards, men of kindly temper and the purest zeal for morality were absolutely devoid of mercy where heresy was suspected. Hatred of heresy was a sort of infectious germ generated by the doctrine of exclusive salvation. It has been observed that this dogma also injured the sense of truth. As man's eternal fate was at stake, it seemed plainly legitimate, or rather imperative, to use any means to enforce the true belief, even falsehood and imposture. There was no scruple about the invention of miracles or any fictions that were edifying. A disinterested appreciation of truth will not begin to prevail till the 17th century. While this principle, with the associated doctrines of sin, hell, and the last judgment, led to such consequences, there were other doctrines and implications in Christianity which, forming a solid rampart against the advance of knowledge, blocked the paths of science in the Middle Ages and obstructed its progress till the latter half of the 19th century. In every important field of scientific research, the ground was occupied by false views, which the Church declared to be true, of the infallible authority of the Bible. The Jewish account of creation and the fall of man, inextricably bound up with the Christian theory of redemption, excluded from free inquiry geology, zoology, and anthropology. The literal interpretation of the Bible involved the truth that the sun revolves around the earth. The Church condemned the theory of the Antipodes. One of the charges against Servetus, who was burned in the 16th century, was that he believed the statement of a Greek geographer that Judea is a wretched barren country, in spite of the fact that the Bible describes it as a land flowing with milk and honey. The Greek physician Hippocrates had based the study of medicine and disease on experience and methodical research. In the Middle Ages, men relapsed to the primitive notions of a barbarous age. Body ailments were ascribed to occult agencies, the malice of the devil or the wrath of God. St. Augustine said that the diseases of Christians were caused by demons, and Luther, in the same way, attributed them to Satan. It was only logical that supernatural remedies should be sought to counteract the effects of supernatural causes. There was an immense traffic in relics with miraculous virtues, and this had the advantage of bringing in a large revenue to the Church. Physicians were often exposed to suspicions of sorcery and unbelief. Anatomy was forbidden, partly perhaps on account of the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. The opposition of ecclesiastics to inoculation in the 18th century was a survival of the medieval view of disease. Chemistry, or alchemy, was considered a diabolical art, and in 1317 was condemned by the Pope. The long imprisonment of Roger Bacon, 13th century, who, while he professed zeal for orthodoxy, had an inconvenient instinct for scientific research, illustrates the medieval distrust of science. It is possible that the knowledge of nature would have progressed little, even if this distrust of science on theological grounds had not prevailed, for Greek science had ceased to advance 500 years before Christianity became powerful. After about 200 BC, no important discoveries were made. The explanation of this decay is not easy, but we may be sure that it is to be sought in the social conditions of the Greek and Roman world. and we may suspect that the social conditions of the Middle Ages would have proved unfavorable to the scientific spirit, the disinterested quest of facts, even if the controlling beliefs had not been hostile. We may suspect that the rebirth of science would in any case have been postponed till new social conditions, which began to appear in the 13th century, had reached a certain maturity. Theological prejudice may have injured knowledge, principally by its survival after the Middle Ages had passed away. In other words, harm done by Christian doctrines in this respect may lie less in the obscurantism of the dark interval between ancient and modern civilization than the obstructions which they offered when science had revived in spite of them and could no longer be crushed. The firm belief in witchcraft, magic, and demons was inherited by the Middle Ages from antiquity, but it became far more lurid and made the world terrible. Men believed that they were surrounded by fiends watching every opportunity to harm them. The pestilences, storms, eclipses, and famines were the work of the devil. But they believed as firmly that ecclesiastical rights were capable of coping with these enemies. Some of the early Christian emperors legislated against magic, but till the 14th century there was no systematic attempt to root out witchcraft. The fearful epidemic known as the Black Death, which devastated Europe in that century, seems to have aggravated the haunting terror of the invisible world of demons. Trials for witchcraft multiplied, and for 300 years the discovery of witchcraft and the destruction of those who were accused of practicing it, chiefly women, was a standing feature of European civilization. Both the theory and the persecution were supported by Holy Scripture. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," was the clear injunction of the highest authority. Pope Innocent VIII issued a bull on the matter in 1484, in which he asserted that plagues and storms are the work of witches, and the ablest minds believed in the reality of their devilish powers. No story is more painful than the persecution of witches, and nowhere was it more atrocious than in England and Scotland. I mention it because it was the direct result of theological doctrines, and because, as we shall see, it was rationalism which brought the long chapter of horrors to an end. In the period, then, in which the Church exercised its greatest influence, reason was enchained in the prison which Christianity had built around the human mind. It was not indeed inactive, but its activity took the form of heresy, or, to pursue the metaphor, those who broke the chains were unable, for the most part, to scale the walls of the prison. Their freedom extended only so far as to arrive at beliefs which, like orthodoxy itself, were based on Christian mythology. There were some exceptions to the rule. At the end of the 12th century, a stimulus from another world began to make itself felt. The philosophy of Aristotle became known to learned men in Western Christendom. Their teachers were Jews and Mohammedans. Among the Mohammedans there was a certain amount of free thought, provoked by their knowledge of ancient Greek speculation. The works of the free thinker Averroes, 12th century, which were based on Aristotle's philosophy, propagated a small wave of rationalism in Christian countries. Averroes held the eternity of matter and denied the immortality of the soul. His general view may be described as pantheism, but he sought to avoid difficulties with the orthodox authorities of Islam by laying down the doctrine of double truth, that is, the coexistence of two independent and contradictory truths, the one philosophical and the other religious. This did not save him from being banished from the court of the Spanish Caliph. In the University of Paris, his teaching produced a school of free thinkers who held that the creation, the resurrection of the body, and other essential dogmas might be true from the standpoint of religion, but are false from the standpoint of reason. To a plain mind, this seems much as if one said that the doctrine of immortality is true on Sundays but not on weekdays, or that the Apostles' Creed is false in the drawing room and true in the kitchen. This dangerous movement was crushed, and the saving principle of double truth condemned by Pope John XI. The spread of Averroistic and similar speculations called forth the theology of Thomas of Aquino in South Italy, who died in 1274. A most subtle thinker, whose mind had a natural turn for skepticism. He enlisted Aristotle, hitherto the guide of infidelity, on the side of orthodoxy, and constructed an ingenious Christian philosophy which is still authoritative in the Roman Church. But Aristotle and reason are dangerous allies for faith, and the treatise of Thomas is perhaps more calculated to unsettle a believing mind by the doubts which it powerfully states than to quiet the scruples of a doubter by its solutions. There must always have been some private and underground belief here and there which did not lead to any serious consequences. The blasphemous statement that the world had been deceived by three impostors, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, was current in the 13th century. It was attributed to the free-thinking Emperor Frederick II, who died 1250, who has been described as the first modern man. The same idea, in milder form, was expressed in the story of the Three Rings, which is at least as old. A Mohammedan ruler, desiring to extort money from a rich Jew, summoned him to his court and laid a snare for him. "My friend," he said, "I have often heard it reported that thou art a very wise man. Tell me, therefore, which of the three religions, that of the Jews, that of the Mohammedans, and that of the Christians, thou believest to be the truest?" The Jew saw that a trap was laid for him, and answered as follows: "My lord, there was once a rich man who among his treasures had a ring of such great value that he wished to leave it as a perpetual heirloom to his successors. So he made a will that whichever of his sons should be found in possession of this ring after his death should be considered his heir. The son to whom he gave the ring acted in the same way as his father, and so the ring passed from hand to hand. At last it came to the possession of a man who had three sons whom he loved equally. Unable to make up his mind to which of them he should leave the ring, he promised it to each of them privately, and then, in order to satisfy them all, caused a goldsmith to make two other rings, so closely resembling the true ring that he was unable to distinguish them himself. On his deathbed he gave each of them a ring, and each claimed to be his heir, but no one could prove his title because the rings were indistinguishable, and the suit at law lasts till this day. It is even so, my lord, with the three religions, given by God to the three peoples. They each think they have the true religion, but which of them really has it is a question, like that of the rings, still undecided. This skeptical story became famous in the 18th century, when the German poet Lessing built upon it his drama Nathan the Sage, which was intended to show the unreasonableness of intolerance.